I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to talk about yet. A few things. It's very inspiring to see so many people come out around this book. Really, truly inspiring. Um, I have to say that it was anticlimactic for us because we worked on it for so many decades that by the time it came out, it was like, it's out. So it's really interesting, very inspiring that the reception has been so good. You know, people come up and say, "Oh, it's really well written. It reads very nice. It's very inspiring." And I have to say, personally, it was just good to get it published. It's like overdue, late pregnancy. So I want to say that I'm glad to be here. We're also trying to figure out how to do the book launches. So we've changed a lot. When we were younger and the KDP was around, we would have planned this so carefully, I would have known exactly what Renee and Cindy were going to say. So it was very interesting to sit here and think, I have no idea what they're going to say. but it's given me some food for thought. So I guess I just want to share a few things that have come to my mind literally while sitting at this table. So I guess one thing I want to say is that the KDP was an incredible force in Filipino community in the United States. And I think the book gives a glimpse of that. And in that sense, I think we did a pretty good job. When we were writing the book, you know, the KDP is, there were a lot of left groups in the 60s and 70s, but the KDP has a very interesting characteristic. For all of our mistakes, and we made a lot of them, we basically bonded in a way that a lot of the left groups in that period did not. So it's not an exaggeration that we are a family, and we remain a family. And people who were in the movement, left movement at that time, observed the fact that there's something about the bonding in the KDP that is different. And so when we started the book, like any family, we're all more or less left of center, but we drifted. So we knew right from the beginning that, okay, this has to be a different type of book. And so our guiding principle when we started was that people got to tell their own story. They had to tell the story in the first person, and that was their experience and the way they remember it, and that we would honor that as editors. And I think it was brilliant. Because we would have never gotten it published. It was just allowing people to say, okay, we're all more or less a left of center family, but we've all evolved. And so if you write your story in the first person, that's how we'll edit it. And I think when it all comes together, you do get a sense of where people came from and what they did. And it does manage to give a glimpse of the KDP. So in that sense, I think some of the praise we're getting is merited. And it does capture who we were. You know, I think that both the Philippines and the United States today are in terrible shape. Unfortunately, we're in our 60s and 70s. So it's very disheartening when you've spent half of your life trying to change society for the better, to find ourselves in this predicament that we're in today. So I have to say, there's times I think we could use the KDP, although we're too old to consider pulling it, trying to pull it together. But I think that both in terms of the situation in the Philippines and here, use that as a foil to talk about what the KDP was. So for one, it was a national organization. So this was very important. Although scatterings of people came together and formed the KDP, when it was formed, it was a national organization. The people who were recruited to the KDP after were recruited into a national organization. We don't have that today. There are a lot of Filipino progressives. They're doing incredible work. But that's an important thing to note. And I think the book gives you a glimpse of what it meant that the KDP functioned as a nationwide force. So one is it was revolutionary, it was left, and it was national. So national campaigns would just pop up. If we called a demonstration, they took place in 10 cities. If we identified what the main demand was, it was consistent. If you were in LA, if you were in New York, if you were in Seattle, like that. So that was a very important feature of what the KDP was. And when I look at the situation today, that's when I think, boy, we could use the KDP. The Filipino community voice would be much stronger. And I see that because there's so many individual progressive Filipinos working so hard and looking at how did the KDP do that? So in addition to what Renee and Cindy said, I would say it was a national organization, and it does make a difference. The other thing is we learn from our mistakes. I want to stress some of our mistakes, okay? When we're unabashedly revolutionary, Filipino community back in the 60s was very conservative. So the KDP came on like blockbusters, believe me. So we would be going around trying to collect money for the New People's Army in the Philippines. Boy, that was a hard sell for the Filipino community, trust me. We were selling revolutionary papers even before the KDP. We had the Kalayaan, which had I think a rifle across the top or something. So, but there we were, boldly going out and saying, it's time for revolution. And we learned a lot. I mean, that was our core, and it stayed the same. But Jaime mentioned the Far West Convention, so I can't help but share this. We ended the LA Far West Convention. I still squirm when I think about this. Singing the International in Filipino and in English. And we insisted that the assembly could not end until we finished singing the International, not only in Filipino, but in English, okay? And as people left out of the hall, there was this sinking lesson, or this sinking feeling that the leadership had, which is, we did something really wrong. We're not sure what it is, but this is not good. Okay. And so we spent time criticizing ourselves, so the KDP was very vibrant. So while we made mistakes and we were very bold, we also were pretty thorough in our criticism of ourselves. So we spent a lot of time saying, what was wrong? What did we do wrong? And so we really refined the idea of the fact that although we were revolutionaries, the Filipino community would not be organized as revolutionaries. That we would have to organize the Filipino community as progressives. And that we'd have to accept the fact that they were not revolutionary, and that's fine. If they were progressive and democratic, then that would be the basis for our work. So the KDP changed from that period. While we did national campaigns, we also did, we paid a lot of attention to we saw ourselves as a revolutionary influence on the Filipino community nationwide. So while we had national campaigns, we struggled really hard in every single chapter to say, but what is your community like? What's happening in Seattle? What's happening in Los Angeles? And it's very different. We made a number of mistakes there too. So, in some of the communities that are more developed, they had very conservative Filipino associations, and they had buildings, and we were young and we were impetuous, so we decided we were going to take them over. So we ran revolutionary slates and we lost again and again. But you know, I was up in Seattle a year ago, and we were going to drive the reactionaries out of the Filipino Community Center in Seattle. We failed. But today, the Filipino Community Center in Seattle is a center of incredibly progressive work. Incredible. There's a life in that community. So there's not a direct line between what the KDP tried and what you see today, but there certainly is an indirect line, and it had to do with the fact that we challenged conservative leaders in the Filipino community. Said, there are other things happening to us that you need to pay attention to. We need to pay attention to. And it has to be more than just coordination balls. So the struggle to press the Filipino community to be relevant to the things that are happening to the community. That legacy, in many ways, can be indirectly linked to the work of the KDP. And some of our ex-KDP activists are still active in those communities. The other interesting thing is that although we've drifted politically, and probably I'm afraid sometime if we get together and discuss a political issue, we might find that we really have a lot of disagreements. So like any family, we decide we're not discussing the really difficult questions. But the fact is that the KDP activists, some stayed within the Filipino community and they're very prominent, and others are in the labor movement, they're in the immigration movement, and they're all over. And so you can see people who were in the KDP. Although we went home, we didn't retire politically. So I think we basically still have a force, only it's not concentrated the way we did in the KDP, which was we were focused on the Filipino community. So those are just some of the things I wanted to share. Like I said, each community was very different. So for example, in New York, it was a new community. A lot of the Filipinos were just arriving. It was very different than Hawaii or California, where we had generations of Filipinos. So in New York, our big campaign was to initiate Filipino National Day, where we would bring Filipinos who are just arriving together for a picnic and celebrate Filipino National Day. Whereas in Seattle, we would be fighting with the gangsters who controlled the cannery workers union for years, Filipinos, by the way, and we would launch a very difficult and very militant reform effort for that union, so that the Filipino cannery workers would not have to pay bribes to get up to Alaska. So depending on the chapter, we did a lot of that work, and we weren't just, we were doing a lot of work around the anti-martial law movement, but every chapter was really challenged to figure out where are you and what's happening in your community. And so the KDP was a fairly complex formation. And as Cindy said, a lot of the things that we actually did are not in that book, but I think we did manage to give a glimpse. I'm thinking of one more thing I want to share, which is how nimble the KDP was. So we had a lobbying group. We had sent some activists. We were pretty well known for sending people all over the country. We learned that from the Philippines, by the way. Because at that time in the Philippines, people were being pulled out of the university and sent into the countryside to join the New People's Army. So we took a lot of that and translated it here. So we had no problem sending people saying, oh, you need to move to New York. When? Next week, okay? So we sent people, so we actually sent some people to Washington to center the lobbying efforts. And we were not singing the Internationale anymore in Washington. We were working with a very broad group of anti-Marcos folks. And their main work was lobbying work. Then we find out that there's the 4-H club. Some Filipino progressive calls us from North Carolina. Mm-hmm. So we look around thinking, has anyone ever been to North Carolina? I haven't. So, oh, well, apparently there's a Filipino progressive there who wants to bring to our attention the incredible brutality that these young 4-H Filipino students are experiencing. They're living in sheds. They were promised an education. They're working like slaves. So then we go to North Carolina. Then we find out, oh, they have farms in Oregon. They have farms in Tennessee. So has anyone been to Tennessee? No. So I find myself in Tennessee. That was the KDP. In other words, we felt it was our obligation to address any issue that faced the Filipino community, even if it wasn't where we were. So I want to capture that nuance of what we did. So, you know, we were off to North Carolina, Tennessee, meeting with 4-H students who felt really isolated and like they could never get out of this. And so we arrive. We're not sure what to do either. We're just young and inexperienced, but we know we're going to do something. We then could contact our lobbying people in Washington who are working on Marcos, aid to Marcos, and put on their agenda and say, oh, another thing is we need to do some lobbying to correct this 4-H problem. That was the nimbleness of the KDP. So here you have people who day-to-day work is around military aid to the Marcos dictatorship. And our ability to add onto their agenda saying, oh, there's a 4-H issue, which will require some lobbying. So, again, that's a little bit of what's not in the book. But it's really a pleasure to see everybody here and to see the interest. Thanks. You know, regionalism, we encountered it in the Filipino community, but in the KDP it wasn't an issue. The issue that we worked more on was the relation of the Philippine nationals and the Filipino Americans, and how we could meld those two different experiences into one political organization, which we did extraordinarily well at. So. Yeah, I just wanted to add something. You know, those murders stunned us, and we were able to pull a broad coalition that Cindy indicated went on for over a decade, fighting every day. But there was a moment when we had a lot of friends who were ready to support us. But right after the murders, the question was, will the KDP go back into the Union? Okay. So I just want to say a few things about, we did. They murdered two of our activists, and we went back into that union the next day. The blood was still on the floor, okay? And a lot of the progressive left were holding their breath because they were ready to support us, but the question was, will the KDP go back into that union, okay? And I have to say that part of that comes from two places. One is we had a very integrated relationship with the Philippine Revolutionary Movement. And when I look back on it, that's what gave us part of that courage. Because unlike the rest of large portions of the US left, although there were a lot of murders in the US left, but the cultural relationship was, we were integral part of the Philippine Revolutionary Movement, and people were dying and being tortured every day. And so that was part of our overarching culture, which is, and then the other piece of it was, we demanded a lot of each other, and it showed, the question of saying, okay, will we go back in and keep fighting? And that was our hardest day and one of our best days, that decision. And it was based off that decision that a very broad coalition was built. But that kind of violence, you don't always, we oftentimes we're not able to fight back. So I think that the ability to fight back was a culmination of a lot of things that were part of who the KDP was in relation to the Philippine Revolution, and who the KDP was in relation to our own work.